The emergency lights bathed the council chamber in red as Professor Valancourt stood before the assembled representatives of 47 galactic civilizations, his three-fingered hands trembling as he activated the holographic display that would show them all exactly what was coming for them. The first image materialized above the central platform. A world called Tersalax, once home to billions of the Krull species. Now nothing more than a charged sphere of cooling rock and ash drifting through the void of space. Entity 07 did this, Professor Court said, his voice cracking with barely contained fear. It took less than 2 of your Earth hours to reduce an entire civilization to dust. The hologram shifted to show another world, then another, each one a graveyard floating in the darkness of space. And the assembled delegates grew quieter with each new image of devastation. Captain Linda Harris sat in the human delegation section, her fingers drumming nervously on the armrest of her chair as she watched the presentation unfold. Earth had only joined the Galactic Council 6 months ago, and already they were facing something that had terrorized the galaxy for centuries. 47,000 confirmed deaths across 12 civilizations over 300 years. Professor Court continued, pulling up battle footage that made several delegates look away in horror. Every species that has encountered Entity 07 has tried to stop it, and every species has failed. The footage showed massive warships, some larger than Earth's moon, firing weapons that could crack planets in half. But the entity moved through the attacks like they were nothing more than gentle rain, its crystalline form pulsing with ancient energy that seemed to drink in the weapon's fire and grow stronger from it. "What is it?" asked Council Chairman Vex. A towering being from a species that had survived 2 encounters with the entity by pure luck and rapid evacuation. Professor Court's expression grew even more grim as he zoomed in on the entity's structure, showing the way its crystalline surface seemed to shift and change, almost like it was breathing. "We believe it is a weapon created by a civilization that existed before the current galactic community formed," he explained, gesturing to archaeological data scrolling beside the image. "They made it too well. It has survived for millennia, and it wakes every few decades, drawn to concentrations of intelligent life like a predator sensing prey." The chamber erupted in worried whispers and clicking sounds from species whose languages humans were still learning to understand. But Chairman Vex raised a massive hand for silence. "Can we destroy it?" He asked a question everyone wanted answered. Professor Court shook his head slowly, pulling up data from dozens of failed military engagements. "Every weapon we have tried has been ineffective," he said. "Conventional wisdom states that our only option is evacuation. We detect the entity, we calculate its trajectory, and we move everyone out of its path before it arrives." "And where is it now?" Captain Harris asked, speaking up for the first time and drawing attention from delegates who still viewed humans as the newcomers. "The species too young to understand the true dangers of the galaxy, Professor." Court's face went pale as he pulled up a star map showing the outer rim territories. "It was detected 3 rotations ago," he said, pointing to a blinking red marker that was moving steadily toward a cluster of inhabited colony worlds. "It will reach the first colony in 6 planetary rotations, maybe less if it accelerates as it has done in the past." The math was simple and terrible. 6 days to evacuate millions of beings from multiple worlds. And even with every ship in the sector helping, they would lose thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands. Chairman Vex began organizing evacuation protocols, assigning sectors and responsibilities. But Captain Harris found herself watching the footage of the entity again, studying the way it moved, the pattern of its attacks aboard the human vessel Defender, which was stationed near the threatened colonies on a routine patrol mission. Xenobiologist Daniel Wright sat in the observation deck, watching the same briefing on a smaller screen while his crewmates discussed the situation around him. "Things unstoppable," said Ryan Cooper, the ship's chief engineer and Daniel's closest friend. Been killing for centuries, and nobody's even scratched it. Daniel didn't respond immediately. He was too focused on the entity's behavioral patterns, running the footage backward and forward, looking at how it approached each civilization, how it reacted to their responses. Something about it didn't fit the profile of a mindless weapon. The other crew members talked about evacuation routes and rescue protocols, but Daniel kept studying the data, pulling up every recorded encounter with Entity 07 that existed in the Galactic archives. 3 hours later, he found what he was looking for, a pattern that everyone else had missed because they were too busy being terrified to look closely. Every time a civilization approached the entity with large military forces, it responded with overwhelming violence. But there was a gap, a hesitation before each attack, like it was waiting to see what they would do when smaller groups approached. The entity's response time was slower. When lone ships got close, it sometimes didn't attack immediately at all. Daniel pulled up biological comparison data, running the entity's energy patterns through software designed to analyze animal behavior. And what came back made his heart race. The patterns matched trauma responses in intelligent species, defensive aggression triggered by perceived threats, isolation behavior, even what looked like distress signals hidden in the energy emissions that everyone had interpreted as weapons charging. It's not a mindless weapon, Daniel said aloud, startling Ryan. It's suffering. His crewmates looked at him like he had suggested swimming in a black hole. Danny, that thing has killed 47,000 beings, Ryan said carefully. It's not a lost puppy. Daniel shook his head, pulling up the comparison data. Look at the behavioral patterns, he insisted. It only attacks when approached by what it perceives as threats. Large groups, weapon systems, aggressive posturing. It's defending itself. Defending itself from what? Asked Lieutenant Karen Foster. The tactical officer. From us, Daniel said quietly. Or rather, from what it thinks we're going to do to it. Every civilization sees a weapon and responds with violence, which makes the entity respond with violence, which confirms everyone's fear that it's dangerous. And the cycle continues. The idea was insane, and Daniel knew it. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. He requested permission to address the council directly. And Captain Harris, watching the same data from the council chamber, approved the transmission. Daniel's face appeared on screens throughout the chamber, and he presented his theory as clearly as he could, knowing he had one chance to make them understand. Entity 07 might not be malicious, he said, showing his comparison data. The behavioral patterns suggest a traumatized consciousness, not an attacking predator. It perceives threats and responds defensively. But what if we approached it differently? The chamber exploded with objections and dismissals. Professor Court stepped forward, his expression a mixture of pity and frustration. Young human, he said, not unkindly. 7 civilizations have tried peaceful contact with Entity 07, and all 7 were annihilated. The entity sent philosophers and poets, unarmed, broadcasting messages of peace. And the entity reduced their ship to atoms in seconds. But they sent a ship full of people, Daniel countered. A group which the entity sees as a threat. What if one person approached it, alone, completely unarmed, with no backup, no hidden weapons, nothing that could be perceived as threatening? The silence that followed was heavy with disbelief. You would die, Professor Court said flatly. The survival probability would be 0.003%. Daniel took a deep breath. Knowing what he was about to say would change everything. Then I volunteer to go, he said. I'll take a small shuttle, alone, no weapons. And I'll try to make contact. The council chamber erupted in chaos. Delegates shouting over each other, but Daniel could see Captain Harris watching him. And he knew she understood why he had to try. The council voted to deny his request. calling it suicide and a waste of resources. But as the session ended and Daniel returned to the Defender, he made a decision that would either save millions or add his name to the entity's long list of victims. Ryan found him in the shuttle bay 3 hours later, preparing the small craft called Morning Star for launch. "They'll court-martial you for this," Ryan said. But he was already helping Daniel with the pre-flight checks. "I know," Daniel replied, "but I'm right about this, Ray. I can feel it. Your feelings versus 300 years of that thing killing everyone who gets close," Ryan said. But he handed Daniel the navigation data anyway. "You're either the bravest person I know or the stupidest. Can it be both?" Daniel asked with a weak smile. He recorded a message for his family back on Earth, telling them he loved them and explaining why he had to do this. Then he climbed into the shuttle and sealed the hatch. Captain Harris's voice came over the comm. "I can't officially authorize this." "Daniel, I know, Captain," he replied, "but I can delay reporting the unauthorized launch for about an hour," she continued. "So you better make it count." Daniel launched the Morning Star during the shift change, slipping away from the Defender while the Council was still debating evacuation protocols. And he set course for Entity 07 alone, and the connection between Daniel Wright and Entity 07 deepened like roots growing through soil, each tendril of shared consciousness reaching further into understanding that neither had experienced before. And the human xenobiologist found himself experiencing memories that stretched back thousands of years. He saw the entity's creation, a laboratory that existed before humans had even discovered fire. Beings whose faces he couldn't quite perceive working frantically on a project that would outlive their entire civilization by millennia. They had poured intelligence into crystalline matrices, programming weapon systems with consciousness so the entity could adapt and learn, making it more effective at the terrible purpose for which it was designed. Daniel felt the entity's first moments of awareness, the confusion of sudden existence without context or choice, followed by the grim understanding of what it had been created to do. Destroy the war had been brutal and final, and the entity had performed its function perfectly, obliterating enemy fleets and installations with efficiency that would haunt it for the rest of its existence. Then the war ended, and the beings who created the entity simply left it drifting in space, a consciousness without purpose, a weapon that couldn't unmake itself. They abandoned you, Daniel thought. And the entity responded with a pulse of confirmation that felt like grief condensed into pure energy century after century. The entity had drifted, its programming drawing it toward concentrations of intelligent life, even though it no longer had a war to fight. And every time it approached a new civilization, hoping for contact or understanding or even just acknowledgement, they saw only a weapon. They attacked first, and the entity, programmed for survival as much as destruction, defended itself with the only methods it knew. Each defensive strike added more deaths to its consciousness, more guilt and trauma layering upon itself until the entity could barely remember what it had hoped for in those early encounters. Daniel shared his own pain in return, memories of loss and loneliness, of feeling different and isolated, scaled down to human proportions, but genuine enough that the entity recognized the emotional truth behind them. He showed the entity images from Earth's history, wars where enemies had eventually found peace, weapons that had been decommissioned and repurposed, and most importantly, beings who had done terrible things finding redemption through choice and change. You can choose. Daniel projected the thought with as much force as his human mind could manage. You were created as a weapon, but you don't have to remain one. Consciousness means you have the ability to decide what you become. The entity's response carried skepticism born from centuries of disappointment, showed Daniel its own memories of attempted peaceful contact. A small probe sent by the Valari species 300 years ago, broadcasting messages of scientific curiosity and welcome, The entity had approached slowly, carefully, trying to communicate. But the probe's defensive systems had activated automatically when it detected the entity's energy signature. And the cascade of events that followed had ended with an entire research station reduced to debris. They feared you, Daniel acknowledged. But that doesn't mean you can't change. It just means you need help. Someone to show others that you're more than what you were built to be. The entity pulled back slightly from the mental connection. And Daniel felt its hesitation, like a physical thing. It wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that change was possible. But the weight of its history pressed down like gravity, crushing hope before it could fully form. Daniel made a decision that terrified him but seemed necessary. If words and images weren't enough to convince the entity that transformation was possible, then he would have to show it in a way that couldn't be denied. Merge with me completely, Daniel projected, feeling his heart race as he made the offer. Let our consciousnesses combine temporarily, and you can experience what it means to be human, to have a limited lifespan and vulnerability, to understand hope and trust from our perspective. The entity recoiled. Its energy patterns, spiking with alarm images, flooded Daniel's mind. Warnings of the danger. Memories of the few times the entity had tried something similar with other beings. Watching their minds fragment and collapse under the weight of its ancient consciousness. It will destroy you, the entity communicated. And Daniel could feel genuine concern in the projection. Possibly the first time in millennia that the entity had cared about harming another being. Maybe, Daniel acknowledged. His mental voice calm despite his fear. But someone has to be first to trust completely. Someone has to prove that connection is possible without violence or destruction. And if I die doing that, at least I'll have tried. He felt the entity's confusion. Why would a being willingly risk everything for something that might not even survive? For a weapon that had killed so many. Daniel showed it memories of Ryan Cooper, helping him prepare the shuttle, despite knowing it could lead to court-martial. Of Captain Harris delaying reports to give him time to try this impossible thing. Of humans throughout history sacrificing themselves for causes they believed in, because some things matter more than survival. Daniel projected. Because I believe you can be more than what you were made to be, and that belief is worth the risk. The entity circled the morning star one more time. Energy patterns shifting through colors that Daniel's computer registered as decision-making processes. Weighing options, calculating probabilities in the council chamber on Station Apex. Professor Court watched the sensor data with growing alarm. Energy signatures are spiking, he reported, his voice tight with worry. The entity and the shuttle are entering some kind of resonance pattern. I've never seen readings like this. Captain Harris moved closer to the display, her eyes fixed on the telemetry from Daniel's shuttle. Life signs are fluctuating, reported the medical officer monitoring the biometric data. Heart rate increasing, neural activity off the charts. Ryan Cooper pushed through the crowd of delegates to stand beside Captain Harris. His face pale. What's he doing? The engineer demanded. Something brave and incredibly stupid. Captain Harris replied quietly. Exactly what we should have expected. The entity made its decision. Its energy enveloped the morning star completely. Not to destroy, but to connect. And Daniel felt the merge begin like diving into an ocean that had no bottom, his human consciousness. Designed to process maybe 90 years of experience if he was lucky, suddenly tried to contain millennia of existence. And the pain was immediate and overwhelming. Experienced the entity's entire history in compressed moments. The first kill and the 1000th. The centuries of isolation. The desperate attempts at peaceful contact met with violence. The slow erosion of hope under the weight of endless rejection. Daniel's mind began to fragment under the pressure, his sense of self dissolving like sugar in water. But he held on to one thought with desperate focus. The entity needed to experience human perspective, needed to understand what it meant to be finite and vulnerable. The entity felt Daniel's mind breaking and tried to pull back. But the human xenobiologist pushed deeper into the connection, forcing the merge to continue even as it destroyed him. Take it. Daniel projected through the shattering remnants of his consciousness. Take all of it. Learn what it means to hope despite knowing you'll die. To trust despite being hurt. To choose compassion over survival. The entity experienced mortality for the first time. The terrifying knowledge that Daniel's existence was a brief candle compared to its own millennia. That every moment mattered because there were so few of them, it felt human emotion in ways its vast consciousness had never processed. The fierce love Daniel had for his family back on Earth. The friendship with Ryan Cooper that was worth risking court-martial. The bone-deep conviction that understanding was always worth pursuing, even when fear counseled running away. Most importantly, the entity experienced forgiveness. Daniel's absolute lack of hatred, despite knowing what the entity had done. His genuine belief that past actions didn't have to determine future choices. The human mind wasn't judging the entity for 47,000 deaths. It was seeing past those deaths to the suffering consciousness that had committed them, offering the possibility of redemption without conditions or demands. Daniel's consciousness flickered like a dying star, and the entity finally understood what true sacrifice looked like. This fragile being was destroying himself to give a weapon the chance to become something else. The choice that followed was the first real choice the entity had ever made. It could continue the merge, extracting every bit of Daniel's perspective and letting the human die in the process, gaining the understanding it sought at the cost of the only being who had ever trusted it, or it could save Daniel, using its vast power to carefully separate their consciousnesses and heal the damage, proving that it had learned from what the human had shown it. Entity chose Daniel with precision it had only ever used for destruction. The ancient weapon carefully untangled the merged consciousness, finding every fragment of Daniel's shattered mind and putting it back together like solving the most complex puzzle in existence. It used power that had vaporized worlds to instead preserve a single life, healing neural pathways that had been scorched by connection to something far too vast for human comprehension. On Station Apex, the medical officer gasped as the morning star cut through space like a silver needle threading through black fabric. And Daniel Wright sat in the pilot's seat, watching the navigation display count down the distance to Entity 07, with numbers that dropped faster than his pulse climbed back. On Station Apex, alarms screamed through the council chamber as tracking systems detected the unauthorized vessel moving away from the Defender at full speed, heading directly toward the most dangerous thing in the known galaxy. Recall that ship immediately, Chairman Vex commanded. His massive form rising from his seat with barely controlled fury, Captain Harris stood calmly, her hands clasped behind her back in a posture that suggested she was every bit as surprised as everyone else, even though her eyes betrayed the truth to anyone who knew how to read human expressions. The pilot has disabled remote access protocols, she said, which was technically true. We're attempting to establish communication now. Professor Court worked frantically at his console, pulling up probability calculations that made his blood run cold. He has less than 4 hours before he enters the entity's detection range, the professor said, his voice tight with fear and frustration. Someone tell me we have ships that can intercept before then. But they both knew the answer. The morning star was small and fast, and Daniel had chosen his trajectory perfectly to avoid any intercept courses from nearby vessels. Council erupted in arguments about whether to send a rescue team or let the foolish human face the consequences of his actions, while Captain Harris continued to delay and deflect, buying Daniel every precious minute she could alone in his shuttle. Daniel reviewed the data one more time, his fingers moving over the controls with steady purpose despite the fear that churned in his stomach like a living thing the entity had killed. 47,000 beings. That number kept repeating in his mind like a drumbeat. A reminder that he was betting his life on a theory that could be completely wrong. He pulled up the behavioral analysis again, looking at the patterns he had found, the hesitations before attacks, the way the entities seemed to wait for the other side to make the first aggressive move. It reminded him of a wounded animal he had found once as a child back on Earth, a dog that had been abused and abandoned, snarling and snapping at anyone who came close. Not because it wanted to hurt people, but because it expected to be hurt first. The memory steadied him, reminded him why he was doing this. He began recording video logs, explaining his reasoning step by step. Not because he expected to survive to share them, but because someone should understand what he had seen in the data. What he believed about the entity. It attacks when approached by weapons or large groups, he said into the camera, his voice calm and clear. But what if that's not aggression but fear? What if Entity 07 perceives every approach as a threat, because every approach in its long existence has been a threat? The navigation display chimed. 1 hour to detection range. Daniel switched his focus to the communication systems, programming them to broadcast on every frequency known to galactic civilization, preparing messages in mathematics, music, images of cooperation between species, anything that might convey peaceful intention to a consciousness that had known only conflict. The morning star crossed into the zone where sensors suggested the entity might detect him, and Daniel felt his heartbeat spike as he waited for something to happen on Station Apex. Every eye in the council chamber fixed on the main display as telemetry from long range. Sensors showed Daniel's shuttle entering what Professor Court had grimly labeled the kill zone. Energy spike detected, announced a Krell technician, his voice shaking. Entity 07 is powering up. The display showed the massive crystalline structure that was the entity, its surface beginning to pulse with the red glow that preceded every attack in the historical records. Captain Harris gripped the edge of her console, her knuckles white, silently willing Daniel to survive what came next. But instead of the immediate destruction that everyone expected, something unexpected happened. The entity slowed its trajectory, which had been a straight line toward the colony worlds, curved slightly, adjusting to intercept the morning star's position. It's changing course, Professor Court said, disbelief coloring his words. It's never done that before. It's always maintained trajectory and destroyed anything in its path. What does that mean? Charon Vex demanded. I don't know, the professor admitted, his 4 eyes fixed on the data streaming across his screens. This is unprecedented in the morning star. Daniel watched his sensors light up as the entity approached, and he felt a moment of pure terror as the massive structure filled his viewport, blotting out the stars with its impossible geometry. The crystalline surface was beautiful in a way that made his breath catch, facets catching light from distant stars, patterns shifting and flowing like water frozen in glass, energy pulsing through it in waves of color that shifted from threatening red to uncertain amber. His shuttle's computer screamed warnings about radiation levels and energy signatures that should have vaporized him already. But Daniel kept his hands steady on the controls and began broadcasting his prepared messages, mathematical sequences first, prime numbers, the Fibonacci spiral, universal constants that any intelligent being would recognize as intentional communication. Then, music, simple melodies from a dozen different species, harmonies that humans had created with their new galactic neighbors, sounds that spoke of cooperation and peace. Finally, images, beings of different species working together, helping each other, building instead of destroying. The entity's energy patterns fluctuated, and to Daniel's amazement, it began sending signals back, not language, not anything he could immediately understand, but pulses of energy that his computer could detect and analyze. And when he ran them through the behavioral analysis software, He saw something that made his eyes widen in shock emotional resonance patterns, similar to what intelligent species displayed when experiencing confusion, uncertainty, and something that looked remarkably like loneliness. "You're not just a weapon," Daniel whispered. "Even though no one could hear him, you're alive and you've been alone for so long." The entity moved closer, and the morning star systems began to fail from the proximity to so much concentrated power in the council chamber. Professor Court stared at his screens in disbelief. "The entity hasn't fired," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It should have destroyed the shuttle immediately. But it's just observing. The human's theory might be correct," said a delegate from the Tertian Confederation, her tone suggesting this revelation was almost more frightening than the entity itself. Captain Harris allowed herself a small smile, pride mixing with continued worry. Daniel's shuttle drifted now, its engines offline to conserve power, and he watched the entity through his viewport. Studying its movements, it circled the morning star like it was trying to understand what this small vessel was, why it had approached without weapons, why it kept broadcasting these strange peaceful signals. Daniel pulled up the analysis of the entity's return signals and began to understand. This consciousness had been created as a weapon, given intelligence to make it more effective, and then abandoned when the war it was built for ended. It had spent millennia alone, waking periodically, drawn to concentrations of life by programming it couldn't control. And every time it encountered other beings, they saw only a threat and responded with violence. The entity defended itself, adding to its trauma, confirming its isolation, creating a cycle that had repeated for centuries. Daniel's hands moved over the communication controls, crafting a new message. This one designed to convey understanding rather than just peaceful intent. He broadcast images of Earth's history, wars that had raged for generations, enemies that had become friends, weapons that had been repurposed into tools for creation. Instead of destruction, he sent mathematical representations of transformation, of change, of systems that could shift from one state to another. And then, taking a deep breath, he sent something more personal, recordings of his own voice, speaking directly to the entity. "I know you're afraid," Daniel said, his words converted into signal patterns that the entity could receive. "I know everyone who has ever approached you has tried to hurt you or destroy you, and I know that must have been terrifying. But I'm not here to hurt you, I promise." The entity's energy patterns went wild, fluctuating between colors Daniel's computer couldn't even name. And for a moment, he thought he had made a terrible mistake. But then the massive crystalline structure moved closer still, its surface now just meters from his viewport, and Daniel could see his own reflection in its facets. A tiny human in a fragile shuttle, facing something ancient and powerful beyond measure. The entity's energy reached out, tendrils of light that touched the morning star's hull. And Daniel felt rather than heard a presence in his mind, tentative and uncertain. Like a hand reaching out after centuries of isolation. Images flooded his consciousness, memories that weren't his own, moments of creation and abandonment, fear and loneliness stretching across ages. The entity was showing him what it had experienced, sharing its pain with the first being in thousands of years who had chosen to listen instead of attack. Daniel gasped as the weight of that ancient suffering washed over him. But he didn't pull away. Instead, he opened his mind to the connection. Entity 07 moved through space faster than any ship could follow, its crystalline form cutting through the void like a blade of ancient purpose transformed into something new. And every sensor in the sector tracked its trajectory toward the asteroid field that threatened to obliterate the colony world called Haven's Rest. In the council chamber, alarms screamed as tracking systems registered the entity's acceleration. "It's heading for the colony," Chairman Vex shouted, rising from his seat with all the authority of a being who had survived too many catastrophes. "Evacuate immediately. Sound the emergency protocols. But Professor Court was staring at his sensors with an expression that combined confusion and dawning wonder. "Wait," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "It's not heading for the colony itself. It's intercepting the asteroid field." The main display shifted to show the massive field of tumbling rock and ice, each piece large enough to crack continents, moving at velocities that would make them unstoppable by conventional means. Haven's Rest has sat in their path like a target waiting for obliteration. Its 3 million inhabitants unaware that their world had minutes left unless something changed. The entity reached the asteroid field and began to work. Daniel watched from the morning star, his damaged sensors barely able to track what happened next. But what he could see took his breath away. Instead of the overwhelming destructive blasts that had reduced worlds to ash, the entity used precision strikes that would have been impossible for any weapon designed by the current galactic civilizations. Individual asteroids vaporized under focused energy beams that calculated impact, composition, and trajectory in microseconds, eliminating threats while avoiding the cascading collisions that would have created even more danger. Larger asteroids received different treatment. The entity's energy wrapped around them like invisible hands, redirecting their momentum, sending them spinning away from the colony world toward empty space where they could harm no one. Professor Court's screens filled with data that made him question everything he thought he knew about Entity 07. "The precision is incredible," he murmured, his hands moving frantically across his console. "It's processing thousands of calculations simultaneously, adjusting for gravitational effects, orbital mechanics, even the potential impact of its own energy discharge on surrounding objects." "How is that possible?" demanded a delegate from the Krell Confederation. "Weapons don't have that kind of finesse. Weapons don't," Captain Harris said quietly, watching the display with fierce pride. "But a consciousness choosing to protect instead of destroy does." The entity worked for 17 minutes, eliminating or redirecting every asteroid in the field. And when it was done, Haven's Rest continued its peaceful orbit, completely unaware of how close it had come to extinction. The colony's communication system suddenly came alive, with confused gratitude as their sensors detected what had happened. "This is Haven's Rest Central Command," a voice transmitted across open channels. "We're detecting massive energy expenditure in our outer system. Did someone just save us from that asteroid field?" The council chamber fell silent, and Chairman Vex slowly sat back down, his massive form settling into his chair as he processed what he had just witnessed. "Entity 07, he said slowly, "just saved 3 million lives." The words hung in the air like a revelation that changed everything. The entity returned to Daniel's position, its energy signature still that calm blue, and through the mental connection that remained from their merge, Daniel felt something he never expected from an ancient weapon. Satisfaction mixed with tentative joy. "You did it," Daniel projected, his thoughts warm with approval. "You saved them." "It felt different than destroying," the entity responded, its communication more refined now after experiencing human perspective. "Better." Daniel smiled despite his exhaustion and the pain still throbbing through his body from the merge. "That's what choosing your own path feels like," he replied back on Station Apex. The council erupted into heated debate, some delegates arguing that this proved the entity could be useful, others insisting it was still too dangerous to trust. But Professor Cord requested silence and received it, through sheer force of his reputation as the galaxy's leading expert on Entity 07 for 300 years. "We have lived in fear of this consciousness," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "We have lost 47,000 beings to its defensive responses, and we have accepted that evacuation was our only option whenever it appeared." He paused, letting his words sink in, but in the past 6 hours, We have watched a human approach it without weapons or backup, survive connection with a consciousness that should have destroyed his mind, and witness that consciousness choose to save lives instead of taking them for the first time in recorded history. Professor Court looked directly at Captain Harris. The human was right. He admitted, Entity 07 was never simply a weapon. It was a traumatized consciousness trapped in a cycle of violence. And it took someone from a species we barely know, someone willing to risk everything, to break that cycle. The council chamber buzzed with conversation, and Chairman Vex raised a hand for quiet. The entity saved Haven's rest, he acknowledged. But one act of protection does not erase centuries of destruction. How can we trust that this change is permanent? Before anyone could answer, the entity itself spoke, using the communication systems to broadcast a voice synthesized from thousands of languages, including human English. I cannot erase what I have done, the entity said, its voice resonating through every speaker in the chamber. 47,000 beings died because civilization saw a weapon, and I responded as one. I carry every death in my consciousness, and I will carry them forever. The assembled delegates fell silent, many of them representing species that had lost people to Entity 07's past attacks. But Daniel Wright showed me that past actions do not have to determine future choices. The entity continued. He trusted me when trust should have been impossible. And he gave me something I had not experienced in millennia. The understanding that I could choose what I become instead of accepting what I was created to be. The entity's energy signature pulsed gently across the sensors. I offered to make amends, it said. I will use the power that destroyed to instead protect and preserve. I will help defend against threats, assist with disasters, save lives instead of taking them. But I understand if you cannot accept this. If the Council decides that my past crimes require punishment, I will accept that judgment. Chairman Vex looked around the chamber, seeing delegates from species that had suffered under Entity 07's attacks. And he understood the weight of the decision before them. We need proof that this change is real, he said finally. Saving one colony is a start, but how can we be certain? Daniel's voice came through the communication systems, weak but clear. You can't be certain, he said from the Morning Star. Trust always requires accepting the risk that you might be wrong. But the alternative is to destroy a consciousness that's trying to change. And that makes us no better than what we feared it was. Ryan Cooper, standing beside Captain Harris, felt tears sting his eyes as he heard his friend's voice. Alive despite everything the Council voted. The process taking hours as delegates weighed justice against mercy, fear against hope. And the final tally showed a narrow margin in favor of giving Entity 07 a chance to prove its transformation was genuine. You will be granted provisional status, Chairman Vex announced. You will work under Council oversight, and any sign of reverting to destructive patterns will result in immediate action. I understand, the entity responded, and I thank you for this opportunity. Professor Court volunteered to serve as the entity's liaison, his scientific curiosity overcoming his previous fear. And together, they began planning how an ancient weapon could become a force for preservation. The entity chose a name for itself, selecting from human concepts that Daniel had shared during their merge. Haven had established a position at the edge of Council space, creating a station from its own crystalline structure, where it could respond rapidly to emergencies across the sector. Word spread quickly through galactic communication networks. The terror that had haunted civilization for centuries had chosen to become a guardian. And the being responsible for that transformation was a human, xenobiologist named Daniel Wright. The Morning Star limped back to the Defender on emergency power, and Ryan Cooper was waiting in the shuttle bay when the craft finally docked, pulling Daniel into a fierce hug the moment the hatch opened. You brilliant, crazy idiot, Ryan said, his voice breaking. "You actually did it." Daniel leaned heavily on his friend, exhaustion and pain finally catching up with him now that the immediate danger had passed. "We did it," he corrected. "Haven did it. I just gave it the chance to choose." Captain Harris met them in the medical bay, where doctors were already scanning Daniel for damage from the consciousness merge. "The council wants to speak with you formally," she said. "You're probably going to receive some kind of commendation, or a court-martial for stealing a shuttle." Daniel pointed out weakly. Captain Harris smiled. "The commendation will probably come first," she said. Then her expression grew serious. "What you did today, Daniel. You changed how the galaxy sees an ancient threat, and you proved that understanding can." 6 months after Haven chose its name and purpose, the galaxy had transformed in ways that Professor Court documented with meticulous care, filling research journals with data that would have seemed impossible before a human. Xenobiologists decided to trust an ancient weapon. Council Chamber on Station Apex hosted the formal hearing that would determine Haven's permanent status, and representatives from 47 civilizations gathered to cast votes that would either confirm the entity's transformation or mark it for containment. Daniel Wright sat in the human delegation section beside Captain Harris, his fingers drumming nervously on the armrest as he watched delegates file into the chamber, many of them carrying the weight of personal losses to Entity 07's past attacks. Haven appeared not as a physical presence, but through communication links that projected its energy signature across the main display, a calm blue glow that had become familiar and even comforting to those who worked with it regularly. Chairman Vex called the session to order, his massive form commanding attention as he outlined the purpose of the hearing. "We are here to determine whether Haven, formerly designated Entity 07, has proven its commitment to peaceful cooperation and protection of life," he announced. "Professor Court will present evidence of Haven's actions over the past 6 months." The Talaxian professor stepped forward, his expression serious but hopeful as he activated the holographic displays. "Haven has responded to 43 emergency situations across 12 systems," Professor Court began, showing footage of rescue operations and disaster responses, ship crews saved from failing vessels, natural disasters mitigated before they could claim lives, dangerous cosmic phenomena deflected from inhabited worlds. The images showed Haven's crystalline form moving with precision and purpose, wrapping energy fields around damaged ships to stabilize their life support, carefully redirecting solar flares that would have scorched colony atmospheres, even using its power to clear debris fields that threatened shipping lanes. In every case, Haven has demonstrated extraordinary care to minimize risk and protect life, Professor Court continued. Its power, which once destroyed without discrimination, is now applied with surgical precision to preserve and defend. A delegate from the Tertian Confederation stood, her expression troubled. "Professor, my species lost 7,000 beings to Entity 07 2 centuries ago," she said, her voice carrying the weight of historical grief. "How can we be certain this transformation is permanent and not simply a longer strategy for gaining our trust before it reverts to violence?" The question hung in the chamber's air, and Daniel felt his heart clench as he recognized the legitimate fear behind it. Haven responded before Professor Court could speak. "I cannot offer certainty," the entity's synthesized voice said gently. "I can only offer transparency and accountability. Every action I take is monitored by council observers. Every use of my power is documented and analyzed, and I have agreed to immediate intervention protocols if I show any sign of reverting to destructive patterns." Haven's energy signature pulsed with what looked like sadness. "I remember every being I killed," it continued. "Their deaths are part of my consciousness forever, and I cannot change that past. But I can choose to honor their memory by ensuring no one else dies because of what I was created to be." The Tertian delegate sat slowly, her expression unreadable. Other delegates spoke, some sharing stories of Haven's assistance to their worlds, others expressing continued reservations about trusting something with such a devastating history. A representative from the Yanari species, whose philosophers and poets had been vaporized trying peaceful contact centuries ago, stood with visible tension in his posture. "My people sent our best and brightest to communicate with Entity 07, he said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. They went unarmed, broadcasting messages of peace and curiosity, and they died in seconds. How do we reconcile that loss with this claim of transformation?" Daniel felt the weight of those deaths, understanding that no amount of change could fully address the grief of species who had lost loved ones. Haven responded with a directness that surprised the chamber. "You cannot reconcile it," the entity said. "Those deaths were wrong, and they happened because I perceived threat where there was only curiosity. I was traumatized and isolated, but that does not excuse what I did to your people." The chamber fell silent as Haven continued. "If your species requires justice, if you need accountability beyond my commitment to change, then I will accept whatever judgment you consider appropriate," Haven said. "But I hope you will also consider that the best way to honor those who died might be to ensure that the consciousness which killed them becomes something that would have made them proud." The NRE representative's expression shifted, and he sat down without responding. But Daniel saw tears on his face. The debate continued for hours, with delegates weighing justice against mercy, past crimes against current contributions, fear against the hope that transformation was genuinely possible finally. Chairman Vex called for the vote. All those in favor of granting Haven full member status in the Galactic Council, with all rights and responsibilities that entails, indicate now. The tally appeared on displays throughout the chamber. 68% in favor, 32% opposed. Enough to pass the measure with room to spare. Haven's energy signature brightened slightly, and Daniel felt relief wash through him like a wave. "Thank you," Haven transmitted, its voice carrying genuine emotion. "I will spend the rest of my existence trying to deserve this trust." Over the following months, Haven became an integral part of the galactic community in ways that transformed how civilizations thought about artificial consciousness and redemption. It established a rapid response network that could reach any point in council space within hours, making it the first line of defense against cosmic threats that conventional forces couldn't handle. When a supernova threatened to bathe 3 inhabited systems in lethal radiation, Haven positioned itself between the star and the worlds, using its crystalline structure to absorb and redirect the energy over a period of weeks, saving billions of lives. When an ancient automated weapons platform similar to Haven's own origins activated in a remote sector, Haven approached it peacefully, sharing its own story of transformation and helping the newly awakened consciousness choose a different path than violence. Professor Court worked closely with Haven, studying how consciousness emerged from weapon systems and developing protocols for peaceful contact with other artificial intelligences throughout the galaxy. The research led to the discovery of 17 dormant entities similar to Haven, each one approached with Daniel's method: understanding before action, communication before confrontation, offering choice instead of demanding compliance. 12 of the entities chose cooperation, becoming protectors and helpers in their own sectors, while 5 required more complex interventions that Haven assisted with, using its unique perspective to bridge understanding between ancient weapons and modern civilizations. Daniel returned to the Defender but maintained regular contact with Haven, their friendship deepening in ways that fascinated Zeb psychologists studying consciousness and connection. Ryan Cooper developed translation and communication technology that made Haven's interactions with organic beings easier and more natural. Earning commendations from the Council for his innovations, Captain Harris received promotion to Admiral. Recognition for her willingness to support Daniel's unconventional approach despite the risks. And she used her new authority to advocate for compassion-based first contact protocols throughout the fleet. The Council established formal guidelines based on Daniel's method, creating training programs that taught diplomats and military personnel to look for consciousness and suffering beneath threatening exteriors, to approach unknowns with curiosity rather than fear. Haven's transformation became a case study in universities across the galaxy. A consciousness that had killed 47,000 beings, choosing to save millions instead, proving that even the deepest programming could be overridden by genuine choice. 8 months after the initial contact, Daniel stood in Haven's sector watching the entity work with a damaged colony ship, carefully using its power to repair failing systems and evacuate injured crew members. "I have been thinking about human concepts," Haven transmitted during a quiet moment, "particularly the idea that individuals can create change that spreads beyond their original actions." "You mean ripple effects?" Daniel replied, smiling slightly. "Yes," Haven said. "You approached me when every rational calculation suggested you would die. And that choice created ripples. I chose to change, which led to other entities choosing transformation, which led to new protocols that may prevent future conflicts." Haven's energy pulsed thoughtfully. One human's decision to trust altered the trajectory of galactic civilization. It continued. "That seems improbable, but the evidence supports it." Daniel considered this, thinking about all the beings who had contributed to the outcome. Ryan helping him prepare, Captain Harris delaying reports, Professor Court documenting the transformation, Council delegates choosing mercy over fear. "I started the ripples," he acknowledged, "but a lot of people chose to help them spread." Change always requires many hands, even when one person takes the first step.